morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I've said it on this platform, and I'll say it again, and I think it is worth repeating. MDC, CCC have been participating in elections out of greed. They have known that the process was flawed, illegal, and that participating would only give the Zanu PF legitimacy. But they've also known that by participating, they'll get the few gravy train seats that Zanu PF has been offering to the opposition to entice them to participate. That is at the heart of our political problem in Zimbabwe. The opposition had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms which would have stopped Zanu PF rigging the elections. And ever since MDC got on the political stage 24 years ago, including the 5 years in the GNU, they failed to implement even one token reform. And they've been participating in these flawed elections out of greed. And Chamisa has become a seasoned liar. He would participate in the flawed elections, claim that they've won those elections. Here is a video clip that has been going round around, people being reminded of what he said after last year's elections.
We reject this sham result and flawed process based on the disputed figures. We have our V11s. I'd asked our teams to bring those V11s. I'm not so sure if they're here so that you would see them. We've brought V11s from across the whole country, and those V11s are going to be the basis of our assertion. We have won this election. We reject this sham result and flawed process based on the disputed figures. We have our V11s. I'd asked our teams to bring those V11s. I'm not so sure if they're here so that you would see them. We've brought V11s from across the whole country, and those V11s are going to be the basis of our assertion. We have won this election.
How many times have we heard him say that? Countless times. The truth of the matter is, the V11s that he claimed that he had, he's never produced them. One of the sources of the V11 last year for Chamisa was Team Pachedu. Team Pachedu have since released their report a year after the elections. And their report, they acknowledged that they had gathered and verified about 84% of the V11 forms. And based on that information, Mnangagwa won 52% of the votes. In other words, confirming the result that ZEC had said. Chamisa himself and his CCC never produced any V11. They did not have the V11 forms. That is at the heart of it. He claimed that he had, when in reality he did not. And this has been picked on, of course, by the Zanu PF apologists, one of them being Professor Jonathan Moyo, known to many of us. he has condemned
the most corrupt politics.
Sorry about that. He has picked on that Tim Pachedu report to underline that Chamisa had indeed lied. And he has come up with the conclusion that Tim Pachedu's released data vindicates ZEC. That is, of course, nonsense. ZEC, the election process, is not judged on the results of the V11. It's judged on the process. The whole process, not just the end result. ZEC failed to produce a verified voters roll. And interestingly enough, Tim Pachedu had done an analysis of those voters roll long before the elections, last year's elections. And they had come to the conclusion that the voters roll was in shambles. They had found out, for instance, that there are many voters who, although they had voted the previous times at a given polling stations, their name was no longer at that polling station. Some of the names had been deleted from the voters roll completely. Others found their names had been moved to polling stations, other polling stations within the same constituency. Others had been moved to polling stations outside the constituency. And yet, other mistakes were that they found some 20 or so registered voters using the same address of a house that has got 1 bedroom. How can that be possible? 20 different voters staying in a house, a 1-bedroom house. That is the shambles that Tim Pachedu had found. Tim Pachedu had failed to come out and categorically state that it would be unwise to participate in the flawed elections. They should have done that, and they should have stuck to their guns on that point. They did not. But that is part of a key process in the election process. And this is the basis on which all the election observers, including SADC, the African Union, who also had observed these elections, had judged the election process. And SADC and all these other election observers had condemned the election process as being flawed on that basis. The process itself was not right. And this is the conclusion of SADC's report. And they made it very clear that the process was flawed. And judging it on the whole process and not just focusing on the V11s. What is the tally of the V11s? And so it is totally misleading for people like Jonathan Moyo to then come up with this view that because Tim Pachedu's own tally of the V11 agrees with ZEC, they vindicate ZEC, and I suppose by extension, vindicate or confirms Mnangagwa's victory, and thus making him legitimate. He is illegitimate because the process was flawed. That's the argument. I think it is a pity that we keep arguing on this very point. And it's all because, of course, we have got Nelson Chamisa and company who were hell-bent, it must be said, in participating in these flawed elections. They knew the election process was flawed. They knew that by participating, they'll give Zanu PF legitimacy. But they still went ahead and participated out of greed. That is the problem we have here. As for Chamisa himself, I think it is no exaggeration that he is a seasoned liar. Chamisa has lied in the past, and we should not be surprised that he's lying now. Team Pachedu, I think they should have stuck to their guts and made it very clear that Chamisa's claim that he had plugged all the vote-ranking loopholes to entice people to participate in these elections, that it was all lies. You cannot plug all the vote-rigging loopholes that are created by the failure to produce a verified voters roll. And there were other loopholes too, indeed. For one thing, ZEC failed to have ballots on the day of voting in urban centers, including Harare itself. And yet, ZEC was able to supply ballots to the most remote parts of the country, in the rural areas. Beggars belief. How can they have no problem distributing ballot papers far and wide, and yet failing to distribute them in the urban center itself? But that's exactly what happened. And we all know that the opposition strongholds is in the urban centers, and Zanu PF strongholds are in the rural areas. So that alone was meant to favor Zanu PF. So there is no disputing that the process itself was flawed. And I think in this particular case, Tim Pachedu's report showing that if you look at only the V11, Mnangagwa won those elections, only serve to confirm the sheer futility of participating in flawed elections and continuing to participate in flawed elections. on the basis of some idiotic claim that I've plugged vote rigging loopholes. I think the people of Zimbabwe themselves have to wake up to the reality that the opposition, MDC, CCC, has failed to implement the democratic reforms, and they've been participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy these last 24 years. And to keep believing that they are nonetheless the best foot forward for the nation is naive, to say the very least. We, the people of Zimbabwe, have to wake up to the reality that we need to implement reforms to make sure elections are free, fair, and credible. We owe it to ourselves. I would like to end playing a video clip of Dr. Nevers Mumba, reminding us of that very point, the need to address the issues of ensuring that elections are free, fair, and credible.
Said to me, Mr. Vice President, go on behalf of SADC, and all I expect from you is to help to give the Zimbabweans a free, fair, and credible election. Those are the only, he said it twice. I need nothing from you, Mr. Vice President, but free, fair, and credible election. You would have done your job. When I was in Zimbabwe, and we were on our way to go and see President Mnangagwa to pay a courtesy call on him, I contacted the president here, President Hakainde Hichilema. I said, Mr. President, we are going to see your colleague. Do you have a word for him? Any greeting, whatever? He said, no. The only thing you tell my colleague is that let's go ahead and give the Zimbabweans a free, fair, and credible election. He repeated the same words. So there was one.
Free, fair, and credible elections. I think that is a very valid point. And when you keep participating in a flawed election and then claim that you've got the evidence to prove that you've won the elections, and when people ask you to produce the evidence, you fail. And this is not the first time this has happened. This has happened again and again. It clearly shows that you participated in these flawed elections knowing fully well that the process is flawed. Knowing fully well that by participating, you're giving vote rigging Zanu PF legitimacy. That is the problem we have here. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, and have a good day.